I'm Anthony Gregory, Research Fellow at the Independent Institute. In case you missed my last column at the Huffington Post, it's called The Bellicosity of a Democrat's Second Term. Let me explain what I mean by that. President Obama said in his inaugural address that we're seeing the end of a decade of war. Well, I fear he might be wrong if the modern history of two-term Democratic presidents is any indication. In 1916, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." At the time, he was engaged in a punitive expedition in Mexico, but in his second term, he proved far more belligerent, dragging the United States into World War I, where 116,000 Americans died. At home, we saw one of the largest expansions of government power in U.S. history. When Franklin Roosevelt became president, the Democrats were still the party of peace and free trade. He changed that forever. In his second term, he began creating the military-industrial complex. He established a peacetime draft. He mobilized the country for war, but he still promised peace. In the third term, he broke that promise, and the U.S. found itself in its biggest foreign war ever. Harry Truman began his presidency at the end of World War II and dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But you could argue that he was even more belligerent in his second term when he launched the first major hot conflict of the Cold War in Korea, all without congressional authority. President Lyndon Johnson ran for re-election against Goldwater and portrayed Goldwater as the warmonger in the race. But having promised peace and becoming re-elected, Johnson escalated U.S. intervention in Vietnam, bringing about one of America's most notoriously awful wars in all its history. Even Bill Clinton fits this pattern. He was an interventionist throughout his presidency, but it was in the second term that we see the most conspicuous interventions. Operation Desert Fox in Iraq, the bombings of Sudan and Afghanistan, and his most violent intervention of all, the Kosovo War. In contrast, when we look back at Republican presidencies of the modern era, they seem more belligerent in the first term. Teddy Roosevelt's brutal counterinsurgency in the Philippines, first term. Dwight Eisenhower's CIA coups in Iran and Guatemala, first term. Nixon started his first term expanding the Vietnam War into Cambodia. By the second term, the troops were coming home. As for Reagan, in his first term, he was rattling the saber against the Soviet Union, reversing détente. But by his second term, he was talking about eliminating nuclear weapons. And then there's George W. Bush, whose first term started the War on Terror and the two biggest foreign wars since Vietnam, in Afghanistan and Iraq. People worried that he'd be worse in the second term or expand the war, but actually his second term appears reserved, at least compared to the first. Which brings us to Barack Obama. Now, he wasn't a peace president in his first term by any means. He vastly escalated the Afghanistan war and the drone bombing in Pakistan. He continued the Iraq war on Bush's timetable. He bombed Yemen. He started a presidential war in Libya. And he's eviscerated the Bill of Rights in many respects. But the question remains, what can we expect for Act Two? Considering the U.S. intervention in Syria, the tightening sanctions on Iran, the blowback we might expect from the drone bombings in Pakistan, Obama has plenty of opportunities to launch a big war in his second term. But does he have the motive? I suspect, like the progressive Democrats before him, Obama wants to be remembered as a great president. What better way to secure his place in the history books and distract the public from his failed domestic policies than to launch another major war? Let's just hope that he breaks the patterns we see in history.